You wouldn't buy a car without a seatbelt, a laptop without Wi-Fi, or go a day without your cell phone. Could a business survive without the internet? Then why are many healthcare providers and provider organizations still not connected and enabled to share critical clinical information digitally in the care of your friends and family? Welcome to Kno2fy, a podcast from Kno2. Join host Dr. Peter Schock, Chief Health Officer, and Teresa Bell, Founder, President, and CTO, as they bring the profound impact of healthcare communication to life through frank conversation in understandable language and through real-world context. They'll demystify interoperability, helping you unlock the potential of healthcare communication at scale. You'll also learn the transformative impact of being Kno2 connected. Connect, listen, transform.
Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Kno2fy. I think this is our 6th episode, and we've been kind of on this journey talking through how interoperability is foundational in solving healthcare's biggest problems, and we've been doing it through the context of a patient journey, and in this case, or a healthcare story. And in this case, we've used the healthcare story of Teresa's father, who suffered a fall. He's a elderly gentleman with Parkinson's and osteoporosis, suffered a fall in the fall of this year, broke a hip, was seen by EMS, transported to a community hospital, and then transferred to a tertiary care center closer to where he lives for a procedure, and then spent some time in a skilled nursing facility before being transferred home with home services. And Teresa was visiting family over Thanksgiving and had the opportunity to take her dad to the neurologist office. And that visit and some of the interactions you had there and how you experienced care there served as a foundation for talking about the impact of interoperability on the provider experience. We actually spent a couple episodes talking about the provider kind of mystique around interoperability, the learned helplessness that providers have, the lack of understanding they have around truly what interoperability brings them as an impact to their business and clinical decision-making. And then we spent the next episode, the one that's live now, talking a little bit about the provider experience and what we call the provider persona of impact, meaning how interoperability actually creates impact in the provider experience that not only improve provider experience, but also solve some of other healthcare's biggest problems. And I think, Trace, we wanted to slate and kind of talk about another persona that we use to describe the impact of interoperability. And really, it's the patient persona, right? And I call this persona me, myself, and I. Or you can call it you, yourself, and yours if you want to. But the truth is we're all going to be patients one day, or have all been patients in the past, of the healthcare system. And we all have our experiences or have seen family members go through experiences. And I believe interoperability has a huge role to play in improving patient outcomes, care coordination for patients, and patient experience in a variety of ways. And I'd like to spend a little time talking about that today, Trace, if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's, especially with the neurologist office, there's multiple points where the experience could have been far better than what was experienced. And interoperability is at the core of it because it was just about the smooth transition from one setting to the next. It's really, we talk about care transitions, we talk about referrals, and that's always the focus in care coordination. And those words get overused, and I don't think they get lost. The meaning of what it really means gets lost because we use them so much. Just like interoperability is used way too much in terms of what it means and the impact of it. But that's what it comes down to. It's really about transitioning from one provider and what they're responsible for to another, and knowing that they know about me and it's opportunity to do that. So I'd love to talk about it.
Yeah, I love that you hit on something there that I think I want to expound on just a little bit before we get started in the conversation. Number one is this idea of care transitions and what does it really mean? Because I think we get numb to it in healthcare. I think we get numb to it in the interoperability space. And what we're really talking about is giving people the information to have the impact we're going to talk about today from a patient experience perspective, or like we talked about last week, from a provider experience perspective. But that's really the purpose of care transitions. We get kind of hung up in and rightly so to some degree in the process of that care transition, but we forget the impact of that care transition as seen through these different lenses that we're going to talk about a little bit today.
Yeah, I was numb as absolutely, and I'll put myself as a guilty party in that, because I spend most of my career on care transitions and discussions around it, and really getting down to the heart of what a care transition looks like and not losing the emotion of it and the benefit of it is critically important. And that would have changed, certainly wouldn't take away the very hard struggle that watching my dad and family go through, but it would have eased it for sure. And it would have eased the anxiety. My sister felt she had to be there 24/7, just the anxiety of, just in case they don't know, somebody's got to be his advocate. And that anxiety, I can't even put words to it. I mean, what she felt, and of course I felt that because I was there and trying to relieve her as the primary caregiver, is just there all the time. And if you just could remove that, the energy that would give that person back. I know it's kind of a weird perspective, but just taking that, they know my dad, they know what medications he's on, they know what has happened, and they know what therapy he's going through, for instance, with the Parkinson's, so they can reflect it into the care plan. Yeah, it's that anxiety alone. And there's so many more examples of different opportunities, but would be phenomenal to remove that.
It's a real interesting thing there too, because it brings out this statement that we've heard or used throughout healthcare around being a patient advocate. And I remember, when I went into medicine years ago, I consider myself the ultimate patient advocate as a physician. And then somewhere in the middle of my career, nurses began to take on that moniker, and it seemed to leave physicians. And it seemed to be that nurses were patient advocates. And I think it was around things like safety and pain, when the pain became the fifth vital sign. Yes, it led to a lot of problems in terms of the opioid epidemic, but it also led to nurses being more seen as patient advocates in that regard and advocating for the care of their patients in different ways. And then it's kind of moved as I had a conversation with one of our own employees who had a healthcare issue with a family member where they went to the emergency room recently. And I listened to her, who had a bad experience in healthcare in the past, and so had a little bit of post-traumatic stress related to going to the emergency room with someone because the prior experience, the outcome was poor, the communication was poor, and there were some mistakes that probably were made in that regard. And so it leaves you with this distrust and this anxiety when you interface with the healthcare system. And so she was interfacing with the healthcare system on behalf of a family member. And her words to me when she called me and asked me about some things were, "Thank you, because now I know how to advocate for that person." Right. And the interesting thing about that is we've kind of taken this idea of patient advocacy from the shoulders of the physician, where it was years ago when I started. And I think most of us physicians feel that we're still there. Expanded it to nursing, and now expanded it a little bit to family members who care for those folks. And as I think about some of these transitions of care and interoperability and being known by my providers, one of the greatest ways that we can be advocates for our patients is to have the information freely flowing across the healthcare ecosystem, so that in these transitions of care, to your point, they're already known to us in large part. At least the big elements are known. And we can spend time building rapport, listening to what's important to them, tailoring diagnosis and treatment appropriately, and so forth. So just another key point. Tracy, before we log into this here, we'll take a quick break. But before the break, I want to talk a little bit about some recent news that just came out, and I wondered if you wanted to speak to it, because I think it does move nationwide interoperability forward. I'm speaking, of course, of the early designation at the ONC event of some of the initial QHINs. We're one of the initial candidate QHINs. There were several of our colleagues that were designated, and we're on track to be designated after the first of the year. But I just wanted to hear from you. I think it's a big event from the perspective of interoperability, and I didn't know if you wanted to comment on it.
Oh, I think it's a huge event. Man, it was an emotional day in a very positive way yesterday. Even I wasn't able to be present in DC, but our CEO was, and had representation with our VP of Interoperability. But listening to it streaming remotely, huge event, because I was there not quite 1 year ago in February, when we had a group of these QHINs that were approved applicants, to then go take on the work effort of building out on our dime, right? Of building out the QHIN, because we didn't get any money. Nobody got any money to do this. And so it's all in the spirit of what we think we can accomplish. But then to watch this first group, which I completely congratulate this first group, worked really hard to get to where they're at, and we're right behind them. We have some extra work that we're applying to it because of our kind of the way we go into market with the communication API. But man, it was cool. It was cool to see it come to reality. This is the second step of many steps that need to come, and really cool to see it, and excited obviously for us to be designated. That should be within the next few weeks, and we'll have it embedded back in the communication API as part of our commitment, kind of broader commitment to our partners, that they are future proof no matter what they do. We have connectivity covered in what they've already integrated to. So that's a little bit of our delay here, but a good delay, good reason for a delay, and not being there in the first group. But man, it was exciting. And now it's about over the next, I'll probably put a 12-month time frame on it to measure from the time we're designated to maybe post it out 1 year from there. How is it going? How is QHIN activity moving? Are we seeing it knock down some of the final barriers that some of the historical networks that are active today haven't been able to knock down? Hopefully so. That is the case. But excited. And I just can't wait for this next 2024 to push on some of the things we're talking about, like transitions of care, and seeing it come through, but also for other non-treatment activities where patient information needs to flow. There's many different opportunities for it. So yeah, I'm thrilled. I can't express it enough.
Yeah, and I just would say to our listeners again and reemphasize what you said. I think every organization that became a candidate QHIN, meaning their application was accepted and they were approved to proceed with building to the QTF or the QHIN technical framework, everybody created their own timeline based upon their internal goals and how they were operationalizing it. And we're operating to our timeline, which we anticipate again right after the end of the year is our intent to be designated. So we'll be standing along them. Right after the end of this year and beginning of next year. Yeah. Then we'll be standing up alongside them and really look forward to partnering with them in the work of building a functional national interoperability framework that will be a critical part of. So I couldn't let the week go without acknowledgement of that, I think, sentinel event in our process. Do I think it's the only significant event? Do I think there won't be other events in the future? No. But it's the next step, I think. And even in the live stream, Teresa, they were talking about the shoulders of the individuals they were standing on in building the framework. The nature of a public-private relationship is that they set the framework and we pay for it. That's usually the way those things happen. But just talking about building on the work that's gone before, with all the standards that gone before, and knowing that Kno2 has been at every stage of significant interoperability development, whether it be standards, networks, et cetera. Kno2 has been at the forefront, helping to provide thought leadership and general leadership in the interoperability space and those things. So,
yeah, absolutely, and so much more to do. I do want to go back to the conversation, just maybe earmark it for after break, is the advocacy piece. I had some thoughts in there in terms of provider burnout, and why maybe we're seeing some of this transition and just the unrealistic expectations that possibly we have on providers right now for advocacy because they can't do it.
Yeah, I'd love to. So. Yeah, that's a real good one. Let's bring that back. We need to have a conversation about that, because I do think I'd love to understand what you mean by unrealistic provider expectations, because I think healthcare executives probably have a perspective, general population probably has a perspective, and providers probably have a perspective on what the unrealistic expectations are. And I don't think they're 100% aligned. Probably a Venn diagram, but I don't think they're 100% aligned. Yeah. So let's take a quick break. We'll come right back and dive into the persona of impact of the patient, me, myself, and I, and how interoperability begins to solve for some of those problems, have impact there, and that can solve for some of our bigger problems in healthcare. Be right back.
All right. Hello. I would like you to introduce yourself super quickly.
My name's Gareth Arch, QA engineer, do testing and kind of automation and testing all the code, make sure it all works and try and break everything.
Perfect. All right. What is your why for working at Kno2 or in healthcare technology?
I enjoy the kind of the fast pace of it. It's helping lots of people. It will make healthcare more accessible to everyone for everything that we're doing. So it's very appealing in that way to kind of better mankind.
Absolutely. All right. What is your all-time favorite movie and why?
Probably Die Hard. I'm watch it every year. It's like the debate of is it a Christmas movie or not? But I just very much enjoy it. Good, lots of action, good comedy in
Okay.
it too. So
Do you consider it a Christmas movie?
yes, that's it.
Okay.
Gotta have the Christmas side to it.
All right. All right. If you were a house, what kind of house would you be?
Perhaps a townhome. I like to kind of have my own space, but also be kind of close enough that I can kind of friends and family and everything nearby if I need to. So
Last question. If you were a spice, which spice would you be?
go with the salt to add a bit of flavor to things. That's it.
All right. I like it.
Connect, listen, transform. This is Kno2fy with your host, Dr. Peter Schuck and Teresa Bell.
Well, welcome back, everybody. We're talking a little bit about interoperability as foundational to solving healthcare's biggest problems through 4 personas of impact. Last week, we talked about the provider and through the provider experience, how that improves healthcare's biggest problems. Today, we're going to talk about the patient, and I'm using me, myself, and I as kind of the designation for that persona because we're all going to be or have been patients in a healthcare system or in need of healthcare. So, Teresa, just let's bring it back to over Thanksgiving when you visited your family and you were continuing the journey of your father. He had a previously scheduled neurology visit that was a regular follow-up visit, not necessarily a follow-up to him being in the hospital. And it was a neurologist who wasn't involved with his hospital care. So his regular neurologist. And you also had services that he was receiving at home, such as rehab and so forth, as he was continuing his recovery. I want to take you back to when we were talking last time, that office visit, and you gave us some great insights in terms of what you were seeing from the provider. I want to turn the psyche around a little bit, and you turned it around on me last week and asked me to talk about it from a provider perspective. I'm going to have you talk about it from a patient perspective because it's most acute with you or most recent with you. Tell me what you were feeling in that room as you walked in there, as there were questions being asked, there were documents being looked for, all of that kind of stuff. Can you just kind of take us through your mindset, if you will, from a patient experience or a family experience perspective to start with? And then we'll talk about, I think that I've got a ton of questions about how you think interoperability would have solved some of those or could have improved some of those. But I'd like to know what you were feeling first, what your experience of the care was. And when I say experience of the care, I don't mean that the care medical decision, not the medical decision pieces of it or the treatment pieces of it, but how it was delivered.
Yeah, and I'll bring back in the provider burnout conversation that we were having right before break.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think you don't want to talk about it, so you avoided it as we came back in. I'm just kidding.
I'm burnt out. Burnt out talking about it. When's somebody going to do something about it? I'm burnt out talking about it. No, go ahead. I don't mean to deflect, but happy to answer any questions there.
So, as you mentioned, sitting in the neurologist's office, this was a visit that had already been scheduled months before. So, accident occurred, surgery occurred, rehab was underway, right? So, he had inpatient rehab, and then he went to the home, and he had home provider with therapy services as part of it. So, this was a scheduled visit in amongst all that, right? So, I take my dad to the visit, and of course, get to the front desk, check in, and they hand me a clipboard, which still astounds me that I get clipboards to fill out, but I have this clipboard that has 4 pages of information on it, back and both sides. And so I'm sitting there, I'm like, with a Parkinson's patient, which obviously that's not going to happen, that he could complete it if somehow he got dropped off, because he's completely capable of conversation and so forth. So if he was dropped off for the appointment, he would not be able to complete any of this. So I'm looking at this saying, well, thank goodness I'm with him, right? So I can walk through this. But I'm looking at it, and these questions were obviously to inform the provider of the gap between the last time that we were seen and now, and to give them any change in condition, any incidences, anything, and to inform the provider prior to meeting with them. So
And
I'm
it
like,
wasn't it wasn't a normal 6-month span of time because he had had this significant event occur in the intervening visits, right? In between visits.
Right.
Yeah.
So we had the whole thing, right?
And one point of clarification too, when you say he has Parkinson's and therefore couldn't fill out the form, not everybody with Parkinson's is afflicted to the same degree and at the same time frame related to their fine motor tremors and ability to write and those kind of things. But that does impact the legibility of what he'd be filling out, his ability to fill that out, as well as some of the cognitive pieces may have impacted that as well, especially after having been in the hospital and gone through a delirium on top of his cognitive impairment. So I just wanted to, sorry, It's the doctor in me. I apologize. Probably wasn't necessary for the group, but if I felt the need to do it. Sorry.
But you feel better. You feel better.
I do. Thank you. I do feel better. Yeah, I felt the burden and pressure there, and I feel better now. So, okay, continue on, please. Pretend it didn't happen.
So as I'm looking at this form, and again, it's to fill the gap of the time in between from the last visit to this one, which was, I think there was 4 months in between, if I'm not mistaken. And so I'm filling it out front, back, 4 pages. And these were not like, there was a few check mark, check yes or no type question, but these were like essay in college, right? This is what I'm going through. And I'm filling it out. I'm working through the details. It's asking for change of condition, anything, notable. And there's like if-then statements. If this is true, then did you experience this, right? And I'm like, okay, this is reasonable that the provider wants to be informed before they see my dad and be able to read through this quickly. But to our point on communication and the ability to have this information, pretty significant information for a Parkinson's patient, right? Including the therapy and the medications he was now on actively that will impact him, right? Nope, none of that. So I'm like, man, if we could have had all of that information provided, and I won't speak for a provider here, I'm going to speak from an engineering mind, but if I could have it in a time sequence format, this would happen, and then have different sections that show, hey, here's the medications, here's current therapy. That seemed logical to me. But then to create, you had used this word a number of months ago, and I really liked it, and it's used obviously in social media, but to curate that into a very welcoming document that the patient would have, or the patient's advocate has, that says, hey, we understand that it's been, sorry to hear that you've been through this. This is what we understand your current situation is. This is the therapy you're under. If you see anything else missing, please advise, or if there's other activity, please advise. But man, that feeling, I was worried I was going to miss something in the form, because now that provider was going to be as good as the information that I was going to provide them. And I wasn't there in every situation.
No, that's the sobering thought that I thought you were getting to at that point, is the full responsibility and weight of the care that he had received outside of the purview of that neurologist fell on you in that moment to deliver. And I just want to ask a couple questions, and these may seem rudimentary questions, but you are not now, or nor have you ever been, a medical doctor. Is that correct?
I don't know about that. I feel that there's at certain times I've spent enough time in the industry. I don't know.
This is not related to my personal feeling that you often play a doctor. This is for the purpose of this conversation.
Like I have a long-term residency that has sufficed for the school.
And you're not now, or nor have you ever been or received clinical nursing training.
That is accurate. I feel like I'm on trial, but yes.
No. Nor are you now, or have you ever been a pharmacist?
Not that I recall.
But yet all of the information that doctor was going to get related to the care that your father received at 2 hospitals and a long-term care facility, rendered by pharmacists, physicians, and nurses, was going to come down to your interpretation about what they told you, documents they gave you that you could distill, a medication list or prescription bottles that you were probably copying off of, and had very little understanding of what they did, how they interacted, and so forth. Is that a fair statement? I feel like I'm not trying to be a lawyer, but I feel like, because I've never been a lawyer.
Are you an attorney? Because that's what this is.
No, not at all. But I want to illustrate how really ludicrous the thinking is there.
Well, I will,
in our society, the thinking.
Yeah, I mean, that is absolutely correct. I have none of those things. I'm an engineer. I will say, I think I bring an unfair advantage to it, even though I'm not a clinician by background. I bring an unfair advantage because I am sitting in these conversations and I do know what gets tracked and I am sitting and interacting. So I'm bringing in a level of knowledge that my sister, who's a hygienist by trade, she doesn't bring to the table. Or to my other sister, who's a graphic artist and somebody else. So I'm
all incredibly intelligent, articulate people who can make good decisions, but don't have a base of knowledge that we're asking them to have, right? To advocate appropriately.
Yeah, and you hope you don't miss. And I know I brought up the experience, how warm it could. There's two sides of it. It's transferring information, critical information, so that the next provider can render care appropriately with the information you have. But I also believe there's a positive to this, because to me that's the disaster avoidance, whatever it is, right? To avoid that critical risk management. But you also have the positive side, is, man, to create that warm experience. When do you ever go to a provider to say, man, that felt great? That I feel like they know me. I feel like I'm their family. There's also the warm side of interoperability that allows for not only the push of information from one provider to another, but also to create a really cool experience off of it for the patient as they're sitting in that waiting room and as they're meeting with the provider. I just think there's both sides to the equation, so that's why I brought up the warm fuzzy.
Yeah. Two things there. Number one, keep digging on that point about the warmth, because I don't think I don't think we've clearly articulated what you're getting at that creates the warmth, but I love it and I want to go there because it's important. So keep digging on that. What is it that creates the warmth about giving the provider the information they need in that circumstance? And we talked about it from a provider experience, but not from a patient experience.
Yeah, there's one thing if the provider has their information right in their EHR. So prior to seeing my dad, that needs to be displayed in a view that's meaningful to the provider with the right information. And then when a patient's coming in, they're sitting in the waiting room and they're waiting to be seen, the opportunities to change, just like transform care delivery in terms of the true patient experience. We're talking about, food, shelter, water here, with giving the information to the provider. But now what can I do with that information to create the best experience for that patient, or that patient as they come in the front door? Man, this feels good. And even how they curate that form is, here's what we understand. We're really sorry to hear about that. And that can be done automated. You absolutely can do that. Sorry to hear that you've had this event. Sorry, this is what we understand about it. But that relief that I feel that they know me and that they have the information and just that I am really cared for, man, you can create a different experience. I think about like my Marriott app. I'm going to just create a really crazy analogy, but I use Marriott. I stay in Marriott, travel all the time. And when I use the Marriott app, it's very personalized to me. And it knows my preferences. It knows what I want. And as I come in the hotel, it's like, hey, welcome, Tracy Bell. Of course, that's all automated. I got it, but I like it. I like that feeling. And versus the old method that I used to have, I walk up and hope to God they have my reservation. I have to give them my name, have to give them. And it's not that if you use the app, right? And the ability to change truly how healthcare is delivered. What we're talking about with interoperability absolutely is table stakes. And that's what we have to do first. This next phase is the next phase, not trying to get ahead of ourselves, but it's within grasp to create that kind of experience for the patient.
So I want to keep bringing us back to the granularity of what you're talking about. And you've talked about a couple of things. I want to try and put a finer point, a summary, and then some finer points on a couple of things. One is that we've talked about a couple of things. One is kind of the care coordination idea, meaning have I given enough information in the care transition that allows a provider to know them and know what has gone on with them so that we can make the next judgments around treatment, management, et cetera, at that visit. So is my care for the patient benefiting from the prior care that all the other providers have provided because I have the information I need, right? That's care coordination from my perspective. Patient safety is in that, in the sense of, do I have an accurate list of their medications and allergies or any new things that might have been discovered while they have received care from other providers between the last time they saw me and the current time. And then this idea of the patient experience through a warmth and perception of being known to the provider. And one of the other things, you didn't say this, but it was implicit in what you were saying, or I implied it, and maybe it's from being a provider that I implied it. In the same way that the reduction of administrative burden for providers that interoperability affords creates an improved satisfaction with their job because they're spending more time with patients, which is what they really got into it for, right? That spending time with patients that's afforded by that information creates the warmth you're talking about. One of my favorite things as a provider, and it's so small, but when I had a provider that was out of state and had a significant problem, or even in a hospital in my large city, and I wasn't the attending physician at that time, whether it was for a procedure or whatever it was, and I had that information, and I could walk into that patient's room and say, Mr. Johnson, I see you were in the hospital and had a hip fracture. Man, that looks like it was a very difficult time for you, and it looks like you're getting better, though. I got the information from so-and-so. Tell me how you're doing. All of a sudden, it creates this rapport that actually allows them to start talking about themselves in a different way that's more than just clinical, and creates, I think, it helps to afford or create space for the warmth you're talking about. But I think that's a really important point around the patient experience. We talk about convenience all the time. We talk about access all the time, and those things are part of patient experience. But sometimes it's, do you see me? Do you know me?
Yeah, both the time it's, do you see me? And do you know me?
Yeah.
Convenience and access, I think it depends on the care setting, right? Is do you see me and do you know me? But yeah, I just think I think it's limitless in terms of what we can do with the data to improve the patient experience.
And then
every other industry does that, right?
Yeah, you're exactly right.
Consumer-driven approach in every other industry. And it's okay. We're behind. That's fine. We're putting up the national networks to do it. And then we need to feed our providers first. But man, tons of opportunity to just drive such a cool experience for patients in their most difficult situations.
I think too, this idea of the consumer, you bring it up, and it's an interesting one. And one of the health systems I worked for most recently was very proactive in kind of changing the dialogue around patient to consumer. And at first, as a physician, it feels weird because historically we think of patients. But the reality of why they did that, I thought, was really important. And it wasn't something that was not thought out. It was thought out in that when you think of a patient, you think of somebody who is unempowered, who is passive, who is a recipient of things being done to them. When you think of a consumer, you think of somebody who has agency, somebody who has choice, somebody who has the power to do different things. They feel empowered. So it's a different mindset, really, when you think about it. And when you really talk about patient advocacy, consumerism in healthcare is really, really important. The other thing that struck me when you said that is probably a conversation for a different day, but I'll just touch on it here. And that is consumerism. Two big changes in the healthcare industry that were late coming to healthcare, but have been present in manufacturing and other business for some time. There are three that are necessary, and two are starting to get inculcated, and the third one's just breaking in. The first one is total quality management. This is Lean Six Sigma. How do we reduce defects, reduce errors, and so forth? It was in the manufacturing area for a long time, brought over by Deming from Japan, the auto manufacturing industry. And it's coming to healthcare. It's been coming to healthcare for the last decade and a half. And it's really begun to improve the reliability of our care, the safety of the care environments, et cetera. Incredibly important, but it's bizarre to think that in healthcare, it's a late adopter of those things. Second one is the market orientation or consumerism. Again, something that's focused on a patient. You have to have the patient to have healthcare, to deliver healthcare. And yet it's something that is putting the consumer at the center of it, and having a consumer-centric mentality is something that's been late coming to healthcare over the last decade and a half, 2 decades. The third thing that's really late coming to healthcare, but it's true and it's impactful in a lot of different areas, we won't get into it today, is just activity-based cost accounting. Do we really know what it costs to deliver the care that we're delivering? And that's an important conversation for anybody in value-based care, anybody concerned about the waste in healthcare in general. And then the other thing I would say about the consumerism piece is it's funny because when we think about care delivery to a consumer, that's one level of experience. I want EHRs and interoperability partners to think about first, who is your primary consumer? Your primary consumers are people who are providing healthcare. What can we do to improve their experience? Again, going back, linking the provider experience to the patient experience conversation. And like you and I have said, you can't get the patient experience you want if you don't have the provider experience you want. And while EHRs through portals and so forth are starting to be direct to consumer in some way, its first and primary consumer is the provider. And how do we do that better? Our first and primary consumer may be EHR partners, but our secondary consumer is the provider in that regard, right? Because they're using the result we do. So let's take a quick break. Let's come back, try and wrap things up for today around the patient experience. I know there's some more. There's so much I want to ask you, Teresa, about, and you uncover a lot of things that I want to make sure we highlight about the patient experience. But you've talked a little bit about care coordination, patient safety, and the patient experience from a being seen and known perspective. When we come back, maybe we'll wrap up the conversation today. And if you have any other comments about any of the other aspects of that, I'd love to hear them. So we'll take a quick break, come right back.
Can you state your name and your title for the organization?
You bet. My name is Dane Moyler, and I'm the VP of Business Development.
Awesome. I know you've answered this probably a handful of times, but what is your why for working at Kno2?
Well, that's probably a little different than most, only because I'm one of the co-founders. So the why is because we had an ambition from the very beginning to connect healthcare, improve just patient care ultimately by improving the workflows. And so the why is ultimately focused on the patient and the efficiency that the health systems gain by doing it in a more contemporary way instead of legacy methods.
So what is the most unique or unusual job that you've ever had? And this can be like starting from when you're like 10 years old until now.
Well, you have to understand my heritage. My parents had a business in the document management business or industry. So as a sixth grader, my after school activity, because I had to walk to the little place where they started their business, and I got to do document preparation by pulling staples. That's pretty exciting.
Wow.
Yeah. The other than that, I've been a busboy, I've been a cook, I've been and then in the technology and document management business for as long as I can remember.
What is a TV show or a movie that you're embarrassed to admit that you love?
Well, everybody is embarrassed for me when I tell them that I think the Teletubbies was an awesome show. And I even had a La doll that someone got me because it had little voice thing if you punched on her belly or him. No one ever could tell. Anyway.
Oh my goodness.
Teletubbies. It was a genius show.
What outfit or trend or hairstyle did you wear or have growing up that you would be mortified to see if it came back in this generation?
Oh, no, you don't understand. I had the Bieber before the Bieber was the Bieber.
Oh, you did?
I did. See, I was in the 70s, and so I had the whole thing going on. And so other than that, I mean, thinning hairline and all that, that's why it's finally just got shaved off. So probably the little swoopy thing I had going on up here before I shaved it off.
Okay, one last question that also says a lot about a person. What would you sing at karaoke night?
Well, all right. So I'm not quite sure why this question's in there because we do karaoke get-togethers at our house frequently.
Oh gosh, okay.
And I am not one of the singers, but because of peer pressure, I am forced to sometimes grab a microphone, there's so many good singers that we have as friends, and my wife is an amazing singer. And so then I have to embarrassingly stand up and choose a song. So my, I guess, favorite, I guess, is Sweet Caroline by
That's a
Neil
good
Diamond.
one.
And then I
I
like,
approve.
what's that?
I said I approve.
Oh, go. This is good. I think the other ones that I frequently sing, Harry Chapin, Cats in the Cradle, and then I'm a big Pink Floyd, The Wall. So
Okay.
those are my
Those
go-to.
are all good. If you were a spice, which spice would you be?
I would probably have to say salt,
Why?
because it is just kind of right down the middle. It's not up here. It's not down there. It's just right down the middle.
Connect, listen, transform. This is Kno2fy with your hosts, Dr. Peter Schuck and Teresa Bell.
Welcome back, everybody. We're wrapping up our episode today on the interoperability's impact on solving healthcare's biggest problems through 4 personas of impact. Today, we're talking about the patient, me, myself, and I, really through patient experience, care coordination, patient safety. Teresa, we talked a lot about a number of those things in the last section. Is there anything that we missed or any other things that you want to make sure that we talk about today or that you bring to light around the patient experience that you saw related to either the neurology visit or the home care and rehab stuff that was going on at all?
Yeah, I mean, specifically, I think it would be redundant to kind of pick back up on those. But, just to kind of summarize, I think if I do the count right, he had 5 transitions from the time of the incident through the neurologist visits and what's continued to be home engagements. The transition of care, that information moving from one care setting to another, and then the sharing of information where it's not necessarily the patient's moving, but medications, for instance, that he was prescribed. That the final end of this patient experience would be I talked about the relief to my sister, who's the primary caregiver, but the ability to access from a patient perspective, the information on demand. That I was at all these settings and there is not one place that a patient can go today and get their information. So unless my sister signed up for the patient portal down at the community hospital that he was transported to, besides the transport itself, can't see that. And then the transport that brought him to the, I think, tertiary hospital, the ability to see that. They are part of Epic there, so she's part of my chart in that particular case. And then the neurologist, and then the home agency. To be able to have one place that the patient goes to grab all of that information for themselves, or be able to see it. You probably have been a pretty loud voice on this. I don't think that a patient can do a whole lot with that information other than just make sure it's transported from one care setting to a next with them where they have gaps in care by the provider. But certainly having access to that information, that is individual access, right? That's a big focus in some of the QHIN initiatives coming forward. There's a lot of debate on should the patient have access to everything? What does it look like? Those debates will be hopefully solved here over the next year or so. But the patient does own their data. And my sister, instead of carrying literally, she has a binder that she keeps and she updates it. So my dad has this record and she asks for records and she keeps the binder and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. That's what she does, right? And then I think about our elderly patients and this population that we have coming in where maybe they don't have a family member or a family member that can be present, or they don't have the advocacy. So individual access is critically important for their safety. Not necessarily that I think they're going to do all this stuff with the information. That's a different debate. But that's where I'd end. It's part of the patient experience is being able to access my own information that you just created, and I appreciate that. Now can I get it and see it and persist it into my next care setting.
Yeah, I love that. And we probably ought to have a whole conversation about that. You and I have talked about a upcoming podcast talking about really information. It's funny because patients have a harder time getting their information, but companies are monetizing that information and creating whole business models and profitability around reconfiguring, analyzing, and selling insights off that data. But patients have a hard time getting it at times. And then the other thing that comes to mind when you're talking about that is we work with folks in the industry technology vendors in the industry who are trying to create easy methodologies for which individuals who have a high burden of illness themselves or care for somebody with a high burden of illness or a chronic medical or developmental problem can keep those get access to those records and keep those records in a common place so that it can ease the burden of actually being a caregiver for somebody in those circumstances. And it's all around affording them the appropriate connectivity into the healthcare ecosystem. And in some cases, too, predicated on the individual access, which I think will open that up a little bit, as you mentioned. So I think we'll leave it there. I really do appreciate you allowing us to continue to share the story of your father and your own personal experience and the rawness of that experience, because I think at times it's what I hear in your voice is a real appreciation for the level of dedication, commitment, and care that providers are trying and often succeeding in giving, but also a recognition that we're not making it as easy for them as possible to do it. And both of those things have an impact on what we experience in care and how good our care can be as we go through the process. So more to come. But again, I think from a perspective of interoperability, foundational to solving healthcare's biggest problems, the patient persona, meaning me, myself, and I, interoperability can solve a number of those issues that make a fragmented system feel much more coordinated, that improve care coordination and therefore clinical outcomes, patient safety, and the overall experience of care, whether it be through access or, as I loved what you said, just being seen by the healthcare system, being seen by my provider is incredibly important because that's when you're seen, you feel cared for. And that's really, really important in healthcare. So we'll leave it there today. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll pick it back up next time.
Thanks for joining us today. That's a wrap for this episode. Please subscribe or follow on your favorite podcast platform to make sure you don't miss an episode. Get Kno2 connected today and set yourself and your organization free to unlock your potential. For more information on the value of being Kno2 connected, visit us at www.kno2.com. Follow us on LinkedIn or Twitter. Connect, listen, transform.